We're going to be joined now by four people who are very active in that distributed collection. I'm interested to hear from each of you about what you do and the collections that you look after as a way to make sense of this idea of a distributed collection. And Melanie, I'd like to start with you. Can you just briefly explain to us the holdings of your museum in Cooktown?
So it's primarily local history, of course. We concentrate on Cooktown itself, but also the outlying regions. James Cook Museum kind of gives away part of the collection. We obviously tell a lot of the story of Cook's time in the area in 1770, given the importance of that story in Australian history. It's the longest he spent anywhere in Australia. It's where they collected the local Indigenous words and a lot of the botanical specimens that they then took back. But of course, Cooktown isn't there because of Cook. It's actually the Palmer River Gold Rush, which started 101 years after that. So a major part of the collection is telling that story, and a big part of that story in itself is the Chinese contribution to the gold rush and Cooktown society. So the Chinese collection is a significant one, but also local stories as well, the businesses, the doctors, the nurses, all the little bits and pieces that went together to make up life in Cooktown, but also the Indigenous side as well, pre-contact and also through the missions and to the present day.
Now, Melanie, I know in the late 19th century, Cooktown had a surge, and upstairs, when we were standing outside the John Oxley Library, and you went, "She's from Cooktown." Can you just briefly describe that photo and what it tells us about that late 19th century town?
Yeah, the photograph is actually of a young woman seated in a very fitting black dress. She's a stunning looking person, really stood out when I started looking through the photographic collection. But we don't know who she was. The photograph is actually in our collection. It doesn't have a name. It has a Cooktown studio name on it, but there are about 4 or 5 studios in Cooktown at the time. So we actually have a really rich photographic collection, mostly of portraiture, so people sitting down and having their portrait taken. We don't even know why she decided to have her photo taken on that particular day, but it certainly indicates that there were people in Cooktown who had the means to pay for a photograph and the reasons to do it as well.
So, Ewen, can you just explain your role? I mean, do you work with collections like Melanie's, or are you working with other types of organisations? So what does it mean to be a museum development officer in far north Queensland?
Oh, it's a combination of both, Kate. I'm based in Townsville and help out small museums, west of Mount Isa, north to Innisfail and south to Proserpine. So within that region there's about 70 small museums. So we help bigger museums like Melanie's, Charters Towers, Bowen, but also very small museums like ones in Julia Creek, Cloncurry, and it's a whole variety of libraries and things as well. We work with Townsville City Council Library. So it depends on who's in the need.
So would that include volunteer-run organisations as well?
They're mainly volunteer-run.
Right.
Yeah. It's very rare that we actually work with paid staff, so it's mainly volunteer-run, and I think that's a very important note to actually make. We've heard this morning about some of those bigger institutions with staff who still use volunteers, but we have small museums with great collections who only use volunteers.
And are they starting, and I know some of those people of course are here, but as a group starting to be aware of their potential to feed into the World War I story?
I think they are. Over the last probably 2 months we've been very active in terms of writing grants with these groups and things. So we're looking at their collections and actually going through and seeing what they have. So we're targeting both federal and state grants, and we're looking at exhibitions or basic summaries or collection management or conservation. So each group varies, but each group does have certain collections within their collections that can tell some sort of story. They may only have collections to do with the home life in towns, in various places, so it could be what sort of furniture was around, or what sort of tools were being used in agriculture, or what sort of home life implements were being used. So by combining some of those objects and combining objects from World War I, we can tell a more complete story.
But if I just keep on going down the line and talk to Leanne from the Museum of Brisbane, so it is the Museum of Brisbane, so how do you define or describe your collection?
It's actually very interesting. The Museum of Brisbane actually cares for a collection. We've just started what we've recently called in the last 12 months a tale of two collections, but they cohabit a single space in an undisclosed location in Brisbane. But we care for the City of Brisbane collection, which is primarily a visual art collection, and it is owned by Brisbane City Council, so we care for that collection. It has other components as well, but it's primarily a visual art collection. We also, as a newly minted company owned by council, have access to City Council archives, which are very rich as well as a historical record of council. But the third and newest of those is the Museum of Brisbane collection itself. So that's evolving and growing as well, more in the area of objects and ephemera than the City of Brisbane collection, but in no way our only drawing point for all of our shows. A starting point, but not the end point at all.
And although you have a defined remit, I guess, I imagine that there are things here or in the state archives or in other collections that might feed into your research or the work that you do. So you're not a satellite.
Not at all, and you don't need to imagine, it's the absolute truth. There's a lot of information out there, and I think for me the most exciting part about us as a museum is that we work with others. And I know that sounds incredibly simple, but I can hear people here today that I can spot in the audience that we've worked with, because we don't have an exhaustive collection, and the collective history of this city rests in lots of collections, and we're very aware of that, all the way from the large institutional collections down to Granny's shoebox under the bed. And I think I have so many stories of the time that I've been at the museum of all of those things coming together to really bring together a fantastic story from those revered collections in institutions all the way through to ones that people have no idea of the value in telling a story and being part of history.
Well, Jo, I'll use that, the idea of the value of telling a story and imagining Granny's shoebox under the bed, to ask you about your role, and in fact you're the person in Kent, of course, my apologies. So what is it that you do, or what is it that these small organisations need from you? Is it connections to each other? Is it connections back to collecting or curatorial practices? What do you do as Museum Development Officer with the organisations you work with?
Well, I suppose it's a mixture of things really, and it depends on what it is that the organisations want from us. So we have a really collaborative and open exchange with the groups, and I can see quite a few of them sitting here in the audience as well, which is really, it's really exciting. Some of the things that we do that have tangible outcomes are write grant applications so that we can actually do put on exhibitions and explore the collections that they might have. So perhaps a good example to use would be we've applied for some funding up in the Atherton Tablelands through a group called the Tablelands Heritage Network, which is a group of about 12 different collecting organisations, historical societies, museums, local libraries, and that's a collaborative grant that we've all put together, and we hope, if we get notification about the funding, that we will be able to put on an exhibition that explores the different stories about the impact of the First World War in those communities. So it's about, for our role, is really about imagining what kind of projects you can develop with the different volunteers. And it's also about really recognising the skills that are out there in the volunteer communities. So we say volunteers, but they're the experts in terms of the local knowledge and the stories. What we do is we help bring their knowledge out and use the tools like grants and then our skills to maybe do some training.
So this is then about supporting a collection to stay in the community rather than collecting it for the Museum of Queensland, for example?
Yeah, we don't have as Queensland Museum Development Officers, we do not collect for Queensland Museum. We support local organisations in their collecting practices and then how they manage those collections, develop accession policies, exhibitions around those. It's our job to support those collections in the regions. And for a lot of those regional areas, it's very important that they stay in the regions for access and for collective memory.
Is it just as important, though, that it be imagined as part of a state collection, though?
I think it is, and I think that the work we're doing actually is making that material accessible. We're at, particularly with the First World War projects, we're at the start of actually opening up the vaults, if you like, to see what's in there, to see who's got what, and then what stories connect back with that broader narrative that comes out of the First World War experience in Queensland. But we've got to start somewhere. Not all of those collections are digitised. Some of them are fabulous collections, and they've done an incredible amount of work with them.
Well, given that, Melanie, what are the stories about World War I that can be told from Cooktown? I mean, we spent a lot of time the other day talking about the particular stories of Queensland, but given the remoteness, if you don't mind the use of that term, of Cooktown, what impact did World War I have on a place like that?
Well, I'm still in the early stages of researching the impact of the war on Cooktown, but in a way it's a really interesting way of approaching Cooktown's history as well, because through looking at the individual stories of the soldiers involved and the families involved, it tells me more about what was happening in Cooktown at the time. It tells me what industries were happening, what people were doing, what businesses were around. But like I said, it was the gold rush in Cooktown that really put Cooktown on its feet, so why Cooktown is there. But the gold started to peter out in the 1880s. So by 1914, the gold was long gone, along with the prosperity of that, and Cooktown was a town in decline. Other industries obviously came in and took over to a certain extent, but the population in Cooktown at the time of World War I was roughly approximate to what it is now, so 2,000 to 2,500 people, and just over 150 young men enlisted in Cooktown. And they're all tin miners and labourers and stockmen, so you're losing a significant portion of the labour force within a small town, which relies heavily on that kind of manual labour. So that must have impacted hugely. Something else that I'm finding is that local businesses and societies supported the war effort financially to a huge extent. There were balls and parties and cricket matches for fundraising all the time. We have in the collection a couple of war loan certificates from local Chinese businesses, and that's one I find really interesting to look further into, because the Chinese obviously suffered fairly prejudicial legislation to restrict entry into Australia in the first place, to restrict business ownership, to restrict any kind of property ownership, in fact. So what was their motivation for buying into a war that they weren't really part of as Australians, because they weren't considered Australians? So it's a really interesting filter to see what Cooktown was like at that time.
And how easy is it for you to tell that story from Cooktown, and how much do you need to use the resources that we heard about, say, this morning, from places like the War Memorial or the State Archives, or even from other towns and other parts of the distributed collection? I mean, can you do it?
Yeah, you certainly can, and particularly with things like the War Memorial being, so there's so many records digitised now, it's too far away for us to go and look these up manually. So to have them online, I can look up a number of soldiers' records within a short space of time from my own desk. That's invaluable when you're researching an exhibition on Anzac like I am at the moment. But even within the town itself, the local historical society, they have a lot more archival material than we do at the museum. They have all the newspapers from the time that aren't on trove. So building those relationships and discussing my collection with them and their collection and what we can share and get from each other, that's all part of the collection within Cooktown, which then goes out further to the bigger institutions as well.
And if other people in this room are wanting to track, say, an economic history of World War I and use Cooktown as an example, can they access the things in your collection or in the work that's being done in Cooktown?
Yeah, I think that's very much a work in progress. We are relatively remote, and although a larger regional museum, we are still relatively small compared to a state institution. So things like digitising for us and having those available as online databases is sometime in the future, but it's certainly something we'd like to work towards. But looking at ways of sharing what we find in our exhibition through online resources, QR codes, and part of the distributed collections idea, having some things online. I use History Pen a lot, and some of the discussions these last few days have made me realise that History Pen's another way of sharing our Anzac photographs and documents online for a wider audience. We also use social media a lot, so we have a Facebook page, and obviously that will have a fairly heavy Anzac content over the next few years.
Ewen, Melanie told me the other day when we were speaking that Cooktown is a place that doesn't have an Anzac memorial, and some of those other things that were established all across the state, particularly in the 1920s. But with the organisations that you're working with, how important is memorialisation as a way into the history of World War I or the preservation? How much is that a focus for the organisations you work with?
I think it's actually a very strong focus. Most of the actual small museums have ended up with lots of honour boards when local schools have closed or businesses have closed or city councils have actually changed premises. Honour boards end up in small museums. And I guess a good one of that is the National Trust Museum in Charters Towers, Zara Clarke Museum. They probably have about 10 honour boards. So they're a really good starting base to actually go through and find out who from Charters Towers actually served in the war, who actually died in the war. And they can lead into other parts in terms of cenotaphs and things around the local regions as well. And we always try and look from that broader regional angle as well. Some of those small Western Queensland towns were actually very small, so they all came together. So when we're looking at Charters Towers, we might look at Hewenden, Julia Creek, back into Townsville, down to Bowen and places as well. And because they were pastoralists and gold miners and it was quite transient, I think it's really important to take that regional point of view as well.
Well, that was a really interesting point that came out yesterday with people talking about the erasure of small communities, because if they're not recorded as being a site from which people went to the war because they had to go to a bigger centre, then they're not part of the official records. And so you have to pull on other things, don't you, like memory and oral history and very, very local knowledge.
That's right, and I think it's really important to actually say that you have to actually start small, and so you start with what you have in those core basic collections, and very quickly you can expand out. So lots of small collections make a big collection, and I guess from a regional point of view, we can track stories like the whole stories through the Gulf country of Aboriginal pastoralists, and I was talking to Gary last night and asking him whether there was any possibility about looking at station records for those Aboriginal stockmen that came back from the war, and whether there'd be any diary notes from people on those pastoral stations noting that someone came back from the war and started working on the pastoral stations. So I guess in terms of hidden heritage and what hasn't been seen, there's great potential there, I think, to actually expand our knowledge.
Well, given that we've been talking about small communities, it's one of the things that the man whose name has just completely left my brain from the Australian War Memorial this morning, Tim, was saying in an earlier conversation that there are also a whole lot of mythologies about who went to the war from where, and as if it was all a regional and rural phenomenon, when in fact huge numbers of soldiers left from the cities, which is my way to get back to you, Leanne, and to talk about the Brisbane story. But we also heard from Raymond Evans on the first day talking about descent on the home front. So there are many, many ways that you could tell a story of World War I from a city like Brisbane. So what are you going to draw on? What sort of stories of World War I interest you as an organisation?
I think there's a number of things that have kind of coalesced for us at the moment. We're planning, we've just, feels like 3 minutes ago, presented to our board our forward program into 2016. So we're at this stage exploring having an exhibition in early 2016, and the reason for that is Brisbane. The starting point, I wouldn't say it's the whole reason, but it's the starting point was the Anzac Parade, not Anzac Day, but the Anzac Parade in Brisbane in April 1916 was one of the first in the country, kind of led that process out. And from what we've read about that parade, it would have been pretty confronting because there were a lot of wounded people who marched that day. And so we start to think about, we had a discussion the other day about home front versus war front, but I guess home front for us isn't the way we're thinking about it. It's important for us, when you think about the history of a city, to bring something up to date So for us, we want to think, well, the events of that time for this city, what is the lasting legacy of that now? And for us, we're really keen to look particularly at organisations that were born from that. And I asked you to just imagine for a moment that being one of the, I think, 50,000 people at the parade, that there was an enormous amount. I'm sorry if that number's wrong. It's 4:30 on a Thursday. But it was an enormous amount of people who were in Brisbane that day and seeing those people, and they were literally freshly wounded from the front. So there's this response from the community about care, and I think that the legacy of Anzac in those that fought, I think, came back and was invested into this community, and we're very keen to track through to now, to what will be 2016, the legacy of the care that came out of that time. So yes, it was born out of horror, but it continues to reinvest into this city and this broader community up till now, and they're the stories we're very keen to trace.
Jo, those are stories that can be difficult to tell because sometimes with an event like World War I, there can be an expectation of what a story is or what's valued, or that the story that has to be told is the story of the soldiers rather than the story of the home front, the story of loss of the soldier rather than the story of the widow. Do you need to work with organisations to convince them that their story is worth telling, that it is of interest, that it does matter?
I think the organisations are really open and receptive to telling a range of different stories. Most of the organisations I work with, I would say, are just waiting for the chance to explore these particular avenues. I really haven't come across any resistance on that level. I think sometimes the tension is between whether or not you tell that story of war or home front. I think that those things can be done in a combined way. I think that there's opportunities to do that. I think that there's already actually tomorrow there's an exhibition opening in Cairns, and that's going to be a really, really interesting one because that is a bit of a combination of looking at home front activities but also linking it in with embarkation marches, and it's through the Cairns Historical Society, and they are doing the thing that we actually talked about, is actually using the resources in their collection that they've got now. They have a very significant photographic collection, and then they've done a lot of research around that using Trove. I mean, Trove, I think, has just opened the doors for so many people, and one of the great stories that they're going to be uncovering or discussing is the Cane Beetle March.
Sorry, could you say
it's called the Cane Beetle March. And it's this fabulous story about, and I don't know enough in detail, but it's a story about 4 soldiers who left a place called Maliba, which is south of Cairns, sort of between Babinda and Innisfail, if that means anything to people. And 4 of these soldiers left home and they walked to Cairns. And along the way, they actually stopped at various places, had some celebrations, picked up people along the way, and gathered a small momentum. I think by the time they got to Cairns, there was 26 of them, which might not sound like a lot, but it was actually quite a significant event for them. And that, as an event, was actually replicated in their Anzac Day celebrations, commemorations, the year after. And so actually, that's a really nice story, I think, of those sorts of things coming together. And when you go through the records in Trove that are around that, it is actually really fascinating what it actually uncovers, because it's talking about some banners that they actually had. And one of the banners they said they had was, it was from Maliba to, it was a destination in Europe, and I can't remember what it was, but on the back of it there was a picture of the Kaiser being attacked by a swarm of cane beetles So it's amazing what kind of things you can come out with. And this is all the research and the work that the people from the Cairns Historical Society have done. And they've done it quite quickly, so they're opening tomorrow. So it's kind of interesting.
So, I mean, given what's been so exciting about this couple of days is hearing stories from all over the state. But for you, Jo, and for you, Ewen, I imagine that's what you're doing in your work all the time. So I wonder if there's anything else, either a sort of particular theme that's come through, or even a particular story like the one we just heard that just surprised you or made you think, wow, these are the stories we can tell from regional Queensland. So I'm just putting you on the spot here.
They're always coming up as well, and I think that as we sort of go further down the track, we'll get more and more small stories, which are, I think, just as important as the bigger ones. The big ones for North Queensland, I guess, is that very first leaving of soldiers to Thursday Island to actually garrison, and they came out of Townsville and Cairns, and that was the very first movement for the war. But those soldiers were actually made up from people from all local rifle clubs. So you had rifle clubs from all around that district who joined up and marched into Townsville and Cairns onto a boat and through Thursday Island. And reading their diaries and things, they talk about that nice romantic journey up the coast of Queensland, through the Coral Sea, past all the islands. So this is before they've really had any connection to war. It's still very romantic, and it's a bit of a holiday, and it's different from being on the pastoral stations or working in the mines. So we're starting to actually pick those stories up, I guess, and because there's actually 5 MDO officers right across Queensland, we can then pick those stories up in Longreach, or pick them up in Biduri, or pick them up in Sunshine Coast. So when we're finally finished, I think we'll have a pretty good grasp of statewide stories that we can try and bring together somehow, or feed back into State Library or Queensland Museum, or share with other agencies across the state.
When I spoke to the 4 representatives of the large organisations this morning in the keynote session, I ended by asking them about how much they collaborate with each other. And so I'd like to ask the 4 of you about that as well. And I don't mean necessarily with the organisation, sitting next to you, but with this sense of a distributed collection. How important or not is that collaborative process of history making? And can I start with you, Melanie?
I think it's very important for many community museums. I think it's really easy to underestimate the importance these small museums and historical societies, the role they play within their community, the sense of pride, ownership and belonging that they can give a community. So the MDOs from the Queensland Museum provide not only a lifeline and a link to other organisations, but also recognition of the work that these societies do. It justifies their existence, it validates them, and really recognises the hours that volunteers put in and the love that goes into these things. But also from a community perspective, they want recognition. It's important for our tourism that people come and have a look at our museums. So sharing our collection, collaborating with other organisations is a fantastic way of gaining recognition and acknowledgement of our collections, but also sharing the really interesting and unique stories that you can only find in our particular museum or our particular region.
I must say, it makes me want to go to Cooktown. Leanne, how does that play out for you with the Museum of Brisbane?
The collaboration for me is on so many levels. I how long have we got? But I guess it's so critical across all sizes. I can't tell you how little size matters in this argument, and I mean that seriously. We're very aware of the large institutions in Queensland and continue to collaborate in the sense of being aware of each other's collections and working in that space. In terms of collaborating on projects largely, I think that's part of a massive ongoing discussion, but collaboration for us in terms of smaller institutions, I find to be one of the richest and personally most satisfying areas to work in. I guess that I hear big and small, and I don't think of ourselves as either. I think of ourselves as very much in the middle of that space, and we're not anything if we're not working with collections of all sizes, and I mean that very seriously. We're very aware that our collection is extremely finite, and the history of Brisbane is infinite. We're making it right now. So dealing with the people who collect it officially or unofficially on all scales is so satisfying to the process. What does it mean for collective history? It is the collective history. That collaborative process is creating history in itself, considering history as multiple viewpoints, not one story, many themes and lines, that it's not a timeline. I was having a conversation in the break about my love-hate relationship with timelines. Yes, Louise will laugh, and as will the staff at the Museum of Brisbane. A timeline tells you one thing, but it can tell you so little. So it's so important to have multiple viewpoints, multiple collections, multiple places where the history resides, because that needs to occur for the richness and the life of it.
Now, Jo, I imagine that for both you and Ewen, collaboration is actually written into your job description somewhere. So rather than asking you if you do it, do you find it dynamic? I mean, is it an exciting process to actually see the collaborative stuff that can happen with the organisations you work with?
It's wonderful. It's a great privilege to actually be able to, facilitate some of that collaborative process. I couldn't do my job without the support that I actually get from the communities that I work with. So, again, I guess I can use the example of the Tablelands group and watching how those particular organisations support each other through that network. It's pretty inspiring to do that. So, if it's my role to perhaps provide some training, facilitate a workshop, bring other people in. But then one of the things that we might do is we might follow it up with an applied workshop. And it's those people who put the energy and the time into doing that, and then they take that back and put it into action. And then you see those results. So it's critical.
So, Ewen, given that Jo has talked about that level of collaboration, I wondered if you could comment on, in terms of your role, with the collaboration back to organisations like the State Library or the Museum of Queensland or the State Archives. How important is that in what you do and in imagining this distributed collection?
Yeah, again, it's very important. I think one of our key stakeholders is also local government. I don't think that's really been talked about much as well. They often run libraries, and they have arts offices and heritage offices and cultural offices. So a lot of our work is done with local councils. And so we work with them, we work with state agencies, all those collecting ones, but we also work with some fairly obscure ones as well, whether it's police departments. Yeah, whether it's sort of police departments or maritime survey and things as well. So lots of these government agencies have historical content within them. And so when we're drawing on an exhibition, we might be talking about islands on the Great Barrier Reef. We might go to the archives and find out what they have in terms of old maps. We might look at surveying. We would talk to local government. We would talk to port authorities. So we engage all the time with a whole range of government agencies. But in terms of those bigger national and state collections, I think it's really good to have them there, that we know that we can draw on them to garnish any sort of material that we can't find. And the staff are always very helpful. And I think that that regional outlook is really going ahead now quite quickly with World War I thing, and I think it's a really good catalyst to make sure it works across Queensland.
And in fact, that's a very good point to end our panel discussion, but also to think forward to what's going to happen tomorrow, and in fact what's going to happen over the next 4 years or so, because those collaborative moments are going to be really important. And then, of course, what we're talking about tomorrow is some of the creative ways of starting to imagine that. But could you please thank Melanie Piddock from the James Cook Museum in Cooktown, Jo Wills, Museum Development Officer, Far North Queensland, Cairns, Ewen McPhee, Museum Development Officer, Coordinator and MDO, Far North Queensland, Townsville, and Leanne Kelly, Program Manager from the Museum of Brisbane. Please thank them all.